the beginning of all this, I actually didn't understand very much about Lafayette's history, and it's become like, with every new detail I learned, it was like about a month ago when it hit me what you just said, like, holy shit, we incorporated to maintain the status quo, and every, like, the language in the general plan about the semi-rural character, which, I mean, it's controversial. I'm not going to take a strong stance on that totally, but like all the language about preservation and maintaining whatever the character of Lafayette is, was the character of 1968. And that was the Fair Housing Act. And it was the moment when segregation couldn't be legal anymore. So if that's the character we're preserving, then I don't think I need to say it. I mean, we agree. I think we all think it's kind of straightforward.
I mean, it's good to like lay these things out plainly. And I think let's just get started. So welcome to Cocktail Conversations that we've already gotten started. I think this is one of these conversations that we think needs a good drink. So feel free to go have a drink, or we're in California, so marijuana. Oh, here's Steven. Hey.
Here enough.
Yeah.
Here in spirit.
Here in spirit. Stephen Falk. So we're pulling together people who have been at least a very big part of the public Lafayette conversation for a while now. You know, I think I'm going to share the Medium post I pulled together that summarizes the tale of trying to get 315 apartments permitted in Lafayette. And of course, how that fits into the larger history of housing in California. But I'm going to start, I think actually with Stephen. Talk to us. You were in, Stephen, with what had been sort of a regular town where housing was not being permitted, maybe at the clip that the state demanded. But, you know, as things blew up, what was your perspective on kind of how things were and how things needed to be?
So first off, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So for some reason, my camera is not working today, so my apologies for that. So I'll just say that to understand the history of this parcel, you don't go back. Let me see. Start my video. You don't go back 10 years. You go back like 80 years. Back to the 1940s, and that's when this fellow named Tony Lodges purchased the property. It's like 1942 or something like that, and that's also when the Contra Costa County zoned the land. And at the time, they thought that this was going to be like this major crossroads of this expressway and this freeway, and so they zoned it for office, so-called administrative professional office. Well, Tony Lodges owned the land for a long, long time. He was kind of a cantankerous hermit who lived on the land and had no interest in developing it. And so it just sat there for a long, 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 long time. And in the year 2000, the city recognized that this was going to be a contentious land use issue once Tony expired and went to the next place, because he was not interested in doing anything with it. And so, but he was also, like I said, cantankerous, and he had said he would oppose anything that the city had proposed for the site. So the city just kind of took a position of benign neglect toward the parcel until this 2000 general plan, where in that plan said, hey, this is going to be a big deal. It's going to be a big controversial deal. And so the city needs to start planning for what's going to happen here. And it ordered.
Stephen, was this part of the housing element RENA general plan update? Was this rezoning for more housing that, or was this a separate decision?
Well, this was before RENA. I mean, I date myself here, but this is before there was a housing crisis. And
wow.
I mean, depending upon, you know, I mean, this is before, I'll just say, you know, The pressures on housing were not as intense back then. I would just say that. I think we can agree about that. And so the general plan ordered the creation of a study, like what to do with this parcel that sits right next to the freeway, in between Deer Hill Road. But Tony was opposed to doing any study or anything with the land. And so the city just didn't want to whack on that beehive. He was a very ornery fellow.
But at that point, the city wanted something to happen. They were sort of still in the, like, we want things in our community to be built, as opposed to, you know, fast forward 20 years and any proposal for anything is bad.
Well, I think what happened was in the 1940s, when the county zoned the land, this is before the city incorporated, they thought that that was going to be where the city center was, at that intersection. And that predated, you know, BART. It was a long time before even BART was a glimmer in anybody's eye. And so in 1972, when the Lafayette BART station opened, I think people realized, hey, that's going to be where the center of town is. It's not going to be down at the intersection with Pleasant Hill Road. And so here you had this big parcel zone for office that was kind of not in the downtown. And so, I mean, what I'm saying is that people knew 20 years ago that this was going to be a controversial development, and but nobody wanted to really touch it while Tony was alive, because he was going to oppose anything. And so when he finally died in 2000, and I think it was 2006 or 2007, that's when the city staff started talking about, well, okay, what are we going to do now that there's kind of this opening? And so in 2010 or 2011, if I recall correctly, we started talking about doing some kind of a specific plan for the site that would have a kind of a community-based input planning process.
So did you guys bring in O'Brien, the developer, to talk about this, or did they find this parcel and purchase it?
This was before that. This is before O'Brien. This is when the Lodges family still owned it. The daughter owned it. And so we went to the city council and we asked for $150,000. I remember this in like 2011 or 2012 to do a big study, a big community-oriented study. And we just didn't get the funding. The council thought that was really a lot of money, and they didn't feel like there was a lot of pressure on this site. It hadn't been developed for 60 years, so it just didn't feel like that was the best use of that money at that time. So we didn't do that specific plan. And then that's just about when the Detmer Lodges family did this partnership with O'Brien, and then this whole project got started.
And so when, I want to skip forward a little bit. I don't want us to lose too many of the facts, but the project was proposed, it was going along, people were unhappy.
Wait, I have a question before we go to chapter 2. Stephen, when you're talking about doing something with the land, those were proposed downzonings, right?
I think that is what the people who were on the planning commission, city council, and in the neighborhood would have preferred at that time. I think that's correct.
Yeah, so I feel like it's a little,
I think what they ultimately wanted at that time was for the East Bay Regional Park District to buy it and annex it to Briones. I think that was kind of the preferred alternative for Lafayette at that time.
Yeah, so Tony may not have really wanted to do anything with the land, but another thing he wanted was to prevent a downzoning.
Absolutely. Yeah, because he felt that would have diminished the value of his property.
Right.
And Jeremy, what do you want to pipe in with?
You've talked a lot about what Tony thought about what should be done with the land. What did his daughter think?
she maintained from the start that she wanted apartments on the site that were affordable, because she felt like Lafayette needed more units, and particularly she liked the location close to Acalanes High School.
Interesting. Well, this gets our first audience question rather snarkily. Is it true that when you don't build housing for people near transit, they simply vaporize? If this is true, I think we have an untapped strategy for curbing population growth and unsustainable consumption. Please comment. From Zach Subin. It seems like the daughter kind of got that maybe there was a need for more apartments, especially near the high school.
Well, I think Sonja is better qualified to answer. The economist in training is better qualified to answer, you know, the questions of supply and demand. These people don't go away, and when you restrict supply, you know, of course it's going to push the price up.
So speeding forward to, okay, eventually there is a developer, there is a proposal for 315 apartments. I guess I also have always wanted to know, the 315 apartments that O'Brien was proposing, and I don't know if Stephen, you can answer this, or Sonja, you can answer this. Did they propose that number in order to freak people out in order to get a better deal? Or did they always really want the 315 apartments? Sonja,
you know, I don't know the answer to that question. I've never asked that question.
Yeah, I think the 315 apartments is the maximum density that they could do and be like perfectly HAA zoning compliant. So I don't know if that's with many things about people's true intentions, I think that's like a bullshit concept. You know, I think that what they had this piece of land, you know, the daughter was like, let's do apartments, let's do moderate income apartments. And so they did the biggest project they possibly could that was still legally defensible. And then it was like, obviously, as time passed, they were amenable to a different thing, despite my objections. But no, I think they meant to do it. And the other thing that's kind of nice about it, you know, they put together the idea for this like during the recession. So it's something that's like kind of recession proof to have a lot of lower priced apartments.
So when they first started making this proposal for all of these apartments, Stephen, what did you think about this? And I guess kind of, I've always wanted to ask, why did you think 44 apartments was a good idea? 44 single-family homes.
Yeah. So when O'Brien made the original proposal for 315 apartments, I think that staff and the planning commission and the city council were surprised, just given how strictly Lafayette has controlled land use during its history. The idea that it would look favorably upon a really big development that's not in the downtown and that is on the north side of Highway 24, where there is no multi-family development, was going to be a high hurdle. It was going to be hard for the developer to get over that. And so, and I also knew about the traffic issues on Pleasant Hill Road and the character of the neighborhoods north of Highway 24. And I just anticipated that this was going to be a big deal. It's going to be a matter of high controversy. And so I went to the city council in a closed session. I said, hey, you know what, maybe we can figure out something that everybody can live with. The developer will be happy with, the residents will be happy with, the city council will be happy with. So let me take a crack at trying to come up with something that makes everybody happy, makes everybody, you know, all the decision makers happy.
Everyone except Sonja. Sonja, how happy were you?
That's before we met Sonja.
Yeah. Sonja,
we were focused on the internals, like the internal players at that time, who inside Lafayette that had been showing up to meetings was going to care about this, and how could we mollify them. We didn't anticipate that Sonja and her crew was going to show up. It just wasn't on our radar.
Sonja, how did you find out about this project?
Saw it in the news. And the developer's attorney was like going on and on. He's like, well, we have the HAA and there's nothing you can do. And it was like during the time of the design review hearing or right before it. So they were, you know, writing about this controversial proposal. And it was panned right at the design review. It got voted against.
Okay, so it got panned, it got scaled back. So you had heard about it before it was now 44 single family homes. You had been watching it a little bit, or?
I don't know. I mean, I don't remember, Stephen, like around the design review hearing, like had you already floated this 44 single family homes idea? Or was that after?
Yeah, I don't really recall the timing with precision. A lot of it is a blur in the past, but so I don't know when we specifically did that.
So what did you think of Sonja's lawsuit? I think that's what we all want to know.
I'm right here, so you're not really going to get the full answer.
No, I'm always pretty open and honest and direct about these things. The city was surprised by it. I think the last time I saw Sonja in person maybe was we had a day-long mediation where we were stuck in a corporate office tower in San Francisco trying to work something out. And I don't think we did we?
No, of course not, because we went ahead. And it was very funny, especially for anybody that's watching that knows about like what Ryan Patterson's normal bread and butter is, you know, or what kind of work Zaxxon Friedman does. But like one of the threats from, I guess I won't say, but you know, the kind of team of people who didn't want us to sue was if you do this right, your name is mud, you know, you'll never have a client again. And it was like so funny to me because Ryan represents people who are trying to build like a small project or NIMBYs who are trying to sue those people. And so, I mean, in California, the idea that someone represents NIMBYs who are trying to stop housing, like wouldn't have any business or there was any way to put them out of business. So funny to me at the time. And so we left, you know, and I was like, well, Ryan, like, are you afraid if you do this, you know, your name will be mud and you won't have any business? He was like, no, not at all. So we went ahead and yeah, I mean, for me, like the reason that I had to wind up writing the petition initially is that it wasn't really that easy to find a lawyer, you know, like as maybe cartoonish as that threat sounds, like frankly, since we were suing the city and the developer, most law firms either usually represent cities or usually represent developers. And so nobody wanted to like touch this because we were going against both. And they were like, who is this lady? You know, I was like, I swear I have $100,000 like I raised to do this lawsuit, but I don't know if they really believe me. But Ryan's firm was like, okay, we'll put down $20,000 and, you know, we'll see what happens. So worked out.
Yeah, I mean, it's an unexpected story. You know, you were doing this before you had incorporated any organization.
It was called SF Barf.
Yeah.
So people were like, this might be a trick. But it was not a trick.
It was a trick. I mean, yes.
Yeah, it was actually. It was one neat trick.
Yeah. Jeremy, when you were in high school at this point, what did you even know about this lawsuit that was happening? And sort of, I mean, it was in the background of the conversation.
I was not paying attention. I did not know about this lawsuit. I did know that there was the development was up for discussion, and I'd been following earlier in high school the 315 units original Terraces proposal. But I was in high school, so it wasn't like a lot of in-depth knowledge that I had managed to develop on my own. The Measure L vote and the lawsuits that surrounded it, I have only learned about in the past few months. And, well, good on you, Sonja, for holding our city accountable. Good on you, Stephen, for listening to Sonja as time went on.
Okay, so Stephen, do you have a question you have always wanted to ask either Jeremy or Sonja?
let me think about that.
Well, and I'll pass that to anybody who wants it. Sonia, do you have a question for Stephen or Jeremy?
Yeah, I mean, really, this is maybe we're jumping ahead, but I really do want to hear a lot more about founding Inclusive Lafayette, and then also like all the high school students, like they're so amazing. Yeah, I want to hear more about that.
So I was starting to talk about this in the schmooze session before we were officially meeting, but I'm happy to go over it again. Essentially, Inclusive Lafayette kind of came out of the blue as my brother and I were reflecting, my brother Benji and I were reflecting on what we could do to address institutional racism in America. And I say institutional racism, that's kind of a vague term, but just racism generally and its continuing impacts. And we were looking at the national situation and it was bleak, and we were looking at the statewide situation and it was too big, and we looked at Lafayette, and it turned out that we are from Lafayette. It's very, very white, so there just isn't a lot of controversy around development. It's all white and primarily rich, and the community, I'd been following the Terraces discussion from a distance for years. We knew it was pretty resistant to serious development. And it was pure coincidence that just over 2 months ago, on June 15th, we started Inclusive Lafayette 2 weeks before the June 30th Planning Commission, where they voted most recently to approve the project proposal. And that was just good luck, because as I've caught up on all of the details that I'd missed earlier on in the conversation, I was confused from the beginning why this is still an issue, and it's only confused me more and more as I learn more of the details and more of the context of the housing crisis in California and the history of racial discrimination in housing that has impacted California as much or more than many other places in the US that we think of as the highly segregated places. Like I don't need to tell the panelists here, I'd be happy to explore in more detail later what I've learned, but it was all largely surprising to me. And the Terraces just seemed to fit so neatly into it because so much of the conversation was rooted in misinformation and oftentimes a community that at the end of the day would bring up things like public health and safety and environmental concerns that made sense in 2011 and 2013 and maybe even 2016 and have been thoroughly studied over all that time. And it's been demonstrated that by now a lot of the community members that haven't changed their minds have other motives. And I think they're well-meaning and decent people. I think the high schoolers and the young people getting involved is a really wonderful thing. It's an interesting, when it comes to housing, a very interesting dynamic because it's the homeowners who really matter. And so you can get all of the support from young people you want and they don't own homes. And so then in Lafayette especially. And so it's a process of trying to encourage people to talk to their parents and talk to their families and make this a real community conversation that's based on people having an open-minded, honest discussion and not looking for villains. That's all that I have been most surprised not to see and hope will occur more in the future. And that's why Inclusive Lafayette.
This intergenerational part of the conversation, I mean, you can look back and sort of say, okay, we're going to look at the 100 years of sort of housing segregation and housing policy, design and exclusion. You can look at the past 10 years of the window through which this project, and I do think, to your point about sort of the well-meaningness of housing opponents, sometimes I'm sometimes skeptical, I've seen a lot. But especially you can sort of get people who are worried about their kids. And there are different ways to be worried about your kids. There are people who are quietly worried that their schools will integrate. And that's their fear. There are people who are worried that their kids won't be able to afford a home in the community because now prices are too high. And, you know, Jeremy, I don't know, like, do you think you'll ever be able to return to Lafayette as a homeowner? I don't know.
Unless I live in my parents' house. Not unless I live in my parents' house.
Yeah, so there's like different ways that you can be worried about your kids. And I do like the quiet part out loud has become really, you know, Donald Trump is sort of helping us with, like, once again, saying the quiet part out loud about protecting the suburbs. I'm sure people have more thoughts. Who wants to hop in?
Wait, I do. Sorry. So Jeremy also, one of the things I was so impressed with was how quickly, you know, you got literally hundreds of people to sign the petition. So it seems like, obviously, I can see how good the response has been. And also, have you had bad responses? Because this is your own community, you know? Has anybody like given you a hard time or given your parents a hard time?
So I think, I mean, the first part of what you were saying, the positive response, I think there are a lot of people in Lafayette who understand the problems California faces, who understand the ways in which Lafayette has not always fully worked very hard to achieve its commitments, its moral and legal commitments to address those problems. And I think that those people largely just hadn't organized very thoroughly. And part of that's because housing's just super complicated and no one had thought, like, let's get a group of people together to figure this out and then project a message. And so I think people were just sitting around waiting for that. And that's why the group has been so successful in the 2 months that it's existed. I think that, to what you and Laura were saying about the people who oppose the housing development, I think Lafayette's community is almost entirely made up of very well-meaning people who care about education and infrastructure and the environment, a number of things that we can all identify with. And some of them are, it's the same set of goals, but they're just a little misguided on how to achieve the same goals. And so I don't think they're ill-intentioned. Some of the misguidedness may be because of these underlying biases, certainly are because of some of these underlying biases that people hold. But I think that the intention does really matter, and the people in Lafayette, by and large, are decent and I think can be reasonable. To the end of your question, Sonja, about the pushback I've received, I have not received completely decent and reasonable pushback. I have heard some quite explicitly racist pushback, people saying, we don't want Lafayette diversified. Some not quite explicitly racist, but just like clearly racist pushback, like, and classist, like, we don't want derelicts coming to our town because that's what affordable housing brings. I can show you the quotes on Nextdoor if you want to see them. They're all there, and I have screenshots of some that have since been removed, and private comments I've received. A lot of the pushback I've received has not been what I just described. It's been people who simply haven't seen accurate information for a very long time, and so they believe inaccurate information is correct. And the groups in Lafayette that have been most organized around the terraces locally have very effectively promoted some of the information that maybe is governing a lot of good, decent, well-meaning people's decision-making. And the issue that we confront, that I've confronted first and foremost, especially, like, it's become more and more clear to me as I've gotten into this, like, people are coming from a framework that's just, I mean, it's like fake news. It's guided by fake news. How do you get people to stop being guided by fake news? Well, you tell them you respect them, and you, please.
Well, I'll let Stephen go next.
Well, I want to amplify a little bit on what Jeremy is saying. By the way, Jeremy, you're just so well informed, and you do such a good job with your presentation. But I want to amplify on your points. And first, I just say that, you know, we live in a world that doesn't reward nuance, and it's a world that does reward name calling and labeling and so on and so forth. There are some, like Jeremy says, there are some great people. There are angels in this community, and I'm thinking about Allison Hill or Art Ungar or Wei Tai Kwok. These are people who are super progressive, who are working hard to try to make Lafayette and make the world a better place. And so I just don't think there's value in, you know, labeling Lafayette as X community when in fact, you know, there's just a lot of people here with a lot of differing viewpoints. But having said that, I mean, I think you have to look at the totality of Lafayette's history and the history of California suburbs to put it into context. And, you know, there was just an article in the Chronicle last week, it was or like late July, wherein a Lafayette resident was talking about how she found racial restrictions in the covenants in her deed, in her real estate deed. And then, so those existed in Lafayette. And then when you look at the incorporation history of the city was incorporated really for one and only one goal, and that was to wrestle land use authority away from the county. What did the city do after it gathered independence? It did one thing. It did the first thing it did it wrote a zoning code that ordered most of the city to be carved up into single family zones with large lots, usually ½ acre or 1 acre, and then limited the multifamily development in and around the downtown, but then put a height limit on the multifamily of 35 feet. Now, when you add those together, what you wind up with is constraining the amount of development that can occur. And when you constrain development, you reduce supply. When you reduce supply, you drive the price up. And when you drive the price up, you ultimately wind up disallowing poor people to move in your community. And poor people are disproportionately Black and brown people. And so whether your intent was racist or not, the outcome, the impact of the policies is racist. And so this is the stuff that I think Jeremy and his crew are working on right now. It's really important. And I think a lot of this is relatively new information to people who live in Lafayette and communities like Lafayette. And, you know, Richard Rothstein has this book out, The Color of Law. A lot of that information has been around for a long time, but it's just getting digested into the general understanding of population now. And so I think these last 3 or 4 years have been tumultuous but also opportunities for doing a lot of learning. I saw there was a quote from the conservative columnist David Brooks in the New York Times just this week, where he said, and I quote, "If your views haven't shifted over the past 4 tumultuous years, you're probably not doing much fresh thinking." And so, I mean, I just think this is a conversation that we're having locally and regionally and statewide and nationally. It's happening everywhere.
Yeah,
and that's a good thing.
That's a great thing. I think there's two, like, you know, the original lawsuit that Sonja filed said exactly all these things, you know? And so I think it is worth thinking about how people have gotten better at hearing that message. I'm not sure that we are saying it more or less, although hopefully we're saying it more and more, and there's more people bringing that message to the forefront that, you know, and you know, the original intent of these laws was to be racist. You know, now that's kind of lost to the sands of time, but it's important for us to look that they still do have racist results. But, you know, I also think that the incentives are really important to talk about, because whether you have racist intent these days, which I'm sure there is like a lot of bias still within, we also have these sort of underlying structural tax problems where, you know, I do understand, and I think that it's you can have a conversation where you get someone to a place where they are admitting that, like, maybe bias is playing a huge role in their fear about new housing in their community. But it's really hard to override the incentives of Prop 13, that they feel like their school district won't get ongoing enough funding to absorb new kids. And that's one that I think it's really hard for us as housing advocates to have a good answer to, because the answer is, yeah, your home should be taxed more to pay for this school district. And that's the answer that they like do not want to hear the most. Sonia, you disagree, but you're muted. Sonia, unmute.
You have to unmute her.
Oh, okay, there you go.
You have to unmute me. I'm sorry, because it's a long story, but anyway, I want to actually, Stephen will probably be able to weigh in on this. I actually don't think that as a practical matter, you know, if we here today, we're like, all right, let's start making it easier for schools to absorb more kids. I don't think that Prop 13 would be the first thing, and I don't think that it's necessarily even funding, because I had a conversation actually with somebody on the school board in Walnut Creek, and I was saying, what are your barriers to rapidly expanding your capacity? And money was not it. It was things like the state law. So I was like, why can't you just rent more, you know, classroom space in existing buildings? She says, like, no, that's impossible. No public school is allowed to do that. Public schools have very strict rules. They have to be like 1-story or 2-story. They have to be in the middle of a giant field, you know? So you can't just build more schools. You can't just rent existing space to increase, you know, increase enrollment. And so like I said, Stephen probably knows more about how this works if you're interested, but I do think it's important.
Yeah, I mean, I also think, Jeremy, you get a lot of the school's argument, and especially I would think it's like really hard for you to swallow as somebody who's like speaking more for the kids than maybe the parents are.
I don't have a problem swallowing it. I don't necessarily think of myself as speaking for the kids as much as just like evidence-based logic and common sense, which I feel like anybody of any age can appreciate. But I do think that the school issue, at least in the context of Lafayette, is very interesting because the schools, people regularly bring up how impacted the schools are, and they aren't. The average classroom size is 20 students. The teacher-student ratio is 20 students per teacher. That's well below the Californian average. And of course, there are caveats there, like some of those teachers are special ed teachers with very small classrooms. So the average class size that the average kid is in is slightly over 20, sure. It's nowhere near the 33 that is the maximum limit in Californian school size. And I don't think we should be pushing that number. It's a really big number. But our schools are very good, and they have excess capacity. And yeah, there are temporary classrooms, and there's excess revenue to afford those, and it's okay. And that's, the education argument gets complicated maybe across California, and it is, to me, at least based on the evidence I've seen, a little less complicated in Lafayette right now.
All right, so I'm going to take 1 or 2 questions from the audience that they've typed, and then we're going to turn it over for public comment, Q&A. So Curtis asked Stephen, were there any interesting or unexpected results of you stepping down as city manager, Stephen? Did you change any hearts and minds as a result? Are some people angry, or are people glad you're gone? Which I think is a mean way of putting it.
So that's kind of difficult to answer. For the most part, I've received a lot of very kind words since I left. I worked for Lafayette for 28 years, and I had just the finest staff all time. And honestly, I had just a great city council. And again, in the effort to introduce nuance into the conversation, I will tell you that, to my knowledge, the City Council of Lafayette has never once turned down a multifamily housing project proposal. Ever.
Wait,
They did not deny the O'Brien project. What they did is they ordered, hold on, ordered a compromise. They ordered a different solution, but it was one that O'Brien agreed to.
Yeah, but the future residents didn't agree.
No, I didn't talk about the residents. Talk about the city council. The city council. I will tell you right now, the Lafayette City Council has just a good track record. It's a good city council. It has been. I was pleased to work with them for a very long time. Now, getting back to the question. One of the surprises to me was after I left, I wasn't sure that another city would hire me. Just because it didn't quite go as quietly as a lot of city managers leave.
Yeah, Jeremy, I need a drink too.
So I was surprised when Richmond reached out and asked me to serve as their interim city manager, and then immediately after that, then when Libby Schaff called and asked me to serve as the Oakland city interim city administrator. And that was heartening. I thought that was really encouraging that there's a place in this world for people who stand up for their values and can be rewarded.
So this is like people defending San Francisco's Board of Supervisors, because they also managed to not directly disapprove much housing because they quietly smother it in its bed as it approaches them, so that by the time it gets to them, it's either dead or scaled back, so they never have to have their naughty fingerprints on the death of housing. And Sonja, if you would like to pile on about all of the places in California that quietly murder housing.
Well, I don't know, speaking of Lafayette City Council, I actually, if somebody knows how to run betting, tell me, because I want to take over-unders on the city council just not voting at all. You know, like the next time they meet is August 24th, and I will pay $30. I believe that they are going to, like Stephen says, they're still not going to vote against it. They're going to do nothing. And then luckily SB 330 exists, and so they will, you know, have by default approved it. But that's not profiles and courage. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know what the point is, but they're not doing so great. One thing that is true though, and that Stephen double checked, I do think that Lafayette blew through its RENA allocation, at least for market rate housing last time. And it did build a ton of housing, relatively, you know, a ton of housing in its downtown, which is something that I know when I started, I don't know, Jeremy, if you're hearing this, was thrown at me over and over again, like, oh, well, we're building so much more housing than like Orinda, like thinking that was gonna get a pat on the back. But, you know, you can be like the best. It's just not a very good pool to compare yourself against. Okay, great. Yeah, thank you.
I think it's worth, with the Lafayette City Council, Stephen is much more familiar with the City Council from, well, the past 30 years, certainly. And I happen to be pretty familiar with the City Council right now. And one thing that they've impressed upon me is that to the member, every single member cares very deeply about Lafayette, and they're not advocates, they're elected representatives. So they have an obligation to both do what's best for the community and the world, and also balance that with their constituents' desires. And that's a really difficult decision for a lot of them. I'm saying this, I have written very harsh emails to the city council members in regard to the August 10th council meeting. I was not pleased with all of the conduct that was happening there, nor all of the lines of questioning and the chains of logic being promoted. It was a disappointing meeting in many ways. But I think that it's worth respecting how important those people are to the community. Like, they're all volunteers. Stephen was the first person to tell me that. They're all volunteers. And they're just putting their time up for the community, and it's an awful lot of time. I appreciate their service.
Sure.
Can I follow up? Yeah, just on Jeremy's point, and again, amplifying his very good point. I think that the council has three competing motivations as this vote approaches on August 24th. one is their responsibility to represent the will of the people, the voters, like Jeremy described. The second is to exercise their own good judgment, because to a large extent, when you're elected, you feel like people are electing you for your judgment. And then the third is to respect California law. And they've got, I'm sure, I haven't sat in on any of the closed sessions for the last 2 years since I left, but they've got a lawyer telling them every meeting, this is what California law is. And so it's just very interesting as an observer to see how are they going to balance that, representing the people, using their own good judgment, and following California law. And that's really, I think, the tension that each of them is feeling as they approach August 24th.
Okay, so we're going to turn it over to public comment. I'm going to share the results of the most people agree that there will be no decision actually made. And I am going to call on people. So Arthur, you've got, well, let's say 1 minute.
1 minute is more than enough. I want to thank Steve for the call out. I appreciate it more than from anybody else. It's really wonderful to be named and by Steve. I have lived here in town since 1965, long before you guys were born, except for Steve. And so I've observed it pretty closely. I was on the Planning Commission 92 to 94. The reason I did not take another term was because I was fed up with the Lafayette residents. It was impossible. I mean, I as the council, really, I mean, Jeremy just mentioned how the council serves volunteers, and if you sit on that side of the table, and you're harassed for 9 hours or 12, as the case may be. I mean, I didn't go through that, I must say, but I found that 5 hours of that was really quite sufficient. And the result is that nobody in their right mind will take the job. You have to have an agenda. Why else would you do that? It's painful. I mean, on the butt, it's painful. So be careful, how you treat these people, because you'll never get, I mean, that's what's happening in the federal government. Nobody will serve because it's too painful. So yes, I'm fine. And the last thing was that people's concern was property values. That was the issue always. Will it hurt because people were borrowed to the hilt. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur, for your fantastic public comment. All right. Tobias.
All right. Pleasure to see you all finally. I get 1 minute per question, right? Oh, okay. Well, in the Q&A little sidebar there, I was asking about housing costs, and Laura, you did mention something, and it was kind of humorous, but just having read Connor Doherty's Golden Gates book, which I highly recommend to everybody to read, building housing really does cost a lot of money, because the process of building itself is just super inefficient, and there hasn't really been a lot of innovation. But I would like for you all to weigh in a little bit more on sort of the reality of what it actually takes, and maybe Steve, you can address that, having seen it from the city side. But that's part of the fight, I believe, for housing, is that how do you get more housing built when it is so darn expensive?
Awesome. So I'm gonna mute you. So Stephen, you can pipe up. I think as activists, it is also true that I want to create a world where innovation in construction is possible, which it just isn't right now. There's so much politics gumming up our ability to actually do work to bring down costs. You know, we're driving up costs with so many different things. We're driving it up with lawsuits. We're driving it up with unpredictability. We're driving it up with, you know, total, somewhat random constraints on what can be built, that like maybe we'll start to get a hold on construction costs as we start to fix our political process. Stephen, you want to pile on?
Well, so I mean, there's land costs, there's construction costs, and the larger your parcel is, and the closer it is into the urban areas, the more expensive the land is. And so, if you have really big parcel sizes, which we have in La Miranda, a lot of these suburban communities, that makes those parcels expensive. And then, as Connor talks about in his book, and Laura, you've talked and written about this too, that, you know, it costs $500,000 or $600,000 to build even a simple studio apartment, one bedroom apartment. And that's just a lot. I mean, the mortgage on the $600,000 unit is a lot. So, you know, a lot of people think that the great hope for affordable housing is going to be manufactured ADUs, additional dwelling units. And I've seen that the cost on those seems to be at least becoming somewhat more reasonable, that you can put one in your backyard for $250,000 or $300,000. But even that seems to me to be an expensive proposition.
Jeremy, you want to pile on?
Yeah, Laura touched on this. She was talking about the barriers to making housing. California, maybe more so than many other states, has a lot of regulations around what you can build where, and it's both at the state level and at the local level, that there are many conditions that the local level can use to delay housing. And some of the well-intended state level regulations, like CEQA, which is a bill I love in abstract, and I have a love-hate relationship in reality. This is controversial, but people weaponize CEQA to try and deny housing developments. And the Housing Accountability Act tries to address some of that by saying certain findings from environmental impact reports can't be used to deny projects in a way that they have in the past. But you get in this very like nebulous conversation where like we really want to protect the environment and endangered species, which is the goal of the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, to maintain the quality of the environment. And we want to make sure we can build housing. And I'm bringing this up because in the terraces discussion, for example, CEQA is something that people who are opposed to the development often point to. It's like, this gives us a grounds for denial, and it doesn't. It doesn't, and not with the HAA protections. And so that's just one example of a regulatory burden that California, more than other areas, has that's expensive. It pushes up development costs. And it's just a complicated conversation because some of the regulations are wonderful and some of them need to be modified to be as wonderful as they could be, is the way.
Jeremy, I can tell you're in Lafayette because yeah.
It's wonderful.
Only there is it controversial to say CEQA thwarts the entire purpose of our environment.
It's not controversial. It's just I don't want to make people think that I hate CEQA. It's like
I hate
don't hate CEQA. I love the environment, damn it. But we have to be honest with ourselves.
Laura and Sonja hate CEQA. We hate it. We hate it. It's terrible.
Yeah.
All right, should I call on the next person?
Yeah.
All right, Kathy, you're up.
Right. I just represent some of the people who want housing for our kids. I wrote a letter about Love Lafayette. Our little bumper sticker and our website is kind of, doesn't seem like we have a lot of Christian values behind that in terms of allowing people to live someplace besides streets. But I think the emotion that gets behind all this legal jargon, and I'm a little bit familiar with the Save Lafayette people, and some of the people that live over there, is about traffic. You know, when my son graduated from Akalani's, he could come home after school. He graduated in 2009. Drive home for whatever purposes he needed to and drive back in time for practice. If he drove home, and we go east with the other end of the highway, we're real close to Orchard Nursery, he wouldn't get back until practice was over. I worked at White Pony Express for a couple of years. Every Tuesday at 2:30 I had to be there. If I left at 2 for a 14-minute drive, I didn't get there until 2:45. I had to leave at 20 of. The traffic, and that's not our traffic, that's not, these 333 units are not going to impact that much. So hopefully whatever benefits might ever come out of COVID, the way we change how we live and work might improve traffic enough that people, you know, you can't pick up your kids on time. School buses would be a great addition to that. And then the traffic also fuels, sorry to say that, the fire fear. And we really had it. That video that fellow saw, I'm sure, showed the other night. I'm sorry I didn't watch all of it. Oh my God, I can't believe people can do that. But people are terrified of this next fire. And they keep saying it's coming. And then traffic on top of that. And how do you get the kids out of school? They were talking about bringing buses into school at the emergency preparedness meetings I went to. They were talking about, forget it, you can't get them out of the school into the multi-purpose rooms and you make a stand there. So there's got to be a better solution there. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Kathy.
I've been responding to a lot of similar questions. Would you mind if I take this one?
Oh,
I know
go
it's
for
the
it.
last one. Okay, so when it comes to the evacuation, first, I really appreciate that you seem to understand that the available evidence does not indicate that the terraces will have a negative impact on traffic or evacuation times. What you were referencing, people don't understand, it's a causality question. We all agree traffic is really bad at the Pleasant Hill Deer Hill intersection, and that whole road, Pleasant Hill Road going back, is a mess right now. But the causality question is, will the terraces, with the currently planned mitigation measures, like extending a lane and having a shuttle from the terraces, will the terraces causally impact traffic at that intersection? After a lot of money spent by the city on private consultants, no evidence indicates yes. Even the evidence that has been paid for by groups that are opposed to the traffic indicates no. People have this, and then the second part of this is like, people are really worried about the evacuation plans because of what a mess the most recent evacuation was. And that makes a lot of sense. It was a scary mess, even if some of the ways people think about it are maybe, I mean, they portray it as like paradise, and it wasn't paradise. It was Lafayette. But the concerns are justified in abstract, but then when you really look at what's happening there, people have an issue with the traffic study, and they say like the traffic study seems to not acknowledge these concerns. Their assumptions must be bad. But the assumptions, most of the assumptions that TJKM used, the traffic consultants for that traffic study, were given to them by the county evacuation planners. Confire, the Contra Costa PD, and County Connections. And that's who's managing the evacuation plans. So the assumptions that were used for the traffic study were based on the current evacuation plans that are in place. If people have a problem with those current evacuation plans, they should take it up with the county, not the developer, because the developer doesn't control those at all. And I don't think your question, I don't have the name of the question asker, but it was like a statement. It was really good and clearly like, I'm not trying to straw man what you were saying. I'm just thinking of the things that other people say and preempting those.
Well, so I think, Kathy touched on this really hard issue, which is you get into this vicious cycle where the traffic is getting worse because we have a chronic housing shortage and people are living further from their jobs. And so people fear new housing because they fear that that will make the traffic worse, which then makes the traffic worse, which then makes them fear that new housing will make the traffic worse, which then the traffic gets worse. And it's a really hard psychology loop to break.
Yeah, it's a doom loop. And also if you're a transit provider, you won't provide transit unless you get a critical mass of riders. And so when you hold density down, population down, you'll never provide transit. And so you get into the same kind of doom loop.
Yeah, and I want to say, so I spent some time, I went to the main library for Contra Costa in Pleasant Hill because I was looking actually for articles around the time of incorporation. I was actually looking for something really damning. You know, I wanted to find like an op-ed that was like, we've got to keep African Americans out. So I didn't find anything like that. It may be there, but I didn't find it. But what I did find was that every single issue, somewhere in the newspaper, somebody mentioned that traffic was bad. From 1968 and 1972, traffic has been bad for 50 years, and nobody's done anything about it. And so that's
lots of things.
Very, very frustrating. So it makes it feel like it's not a real reason, you know, because if people were really motivated, you know, when Waze came out and you know, Google Maps and people started mapping, one of the things, this actually even came up at one of the hearings, Waze started routing people off of the highways because there are some other routes. And then the people who lived on those streets were pissed because there was more traffic going through their neighborhoods. But honestly, that's the path. Like if people are sick of traffic on 24, there needs to be more other routes. And there's all this traffic on 24 because there's no traffic in the neighborhoods.
People think they own local, like public property near them, like roads. They feel ownership.
Yeah, I feel, yeah. So it's like a extremely even more radical thing that Inclusive Lafayette could start doing is being like, how are we going to balance traffic around our system of roads better? And maybe even like make new roads, like pursue.
I'm opposed to that. I'm gonna sequel your new roads.
Bus lines. We can do it. We can run a bus.
I'm gonna turn it over to Bobak.
Hey, can you all hear me?
Long-time listener, first-time caller.
Yeah, first-time caller. I don't have any questions. I first only have two things to say. One is an appreciation for Sonja, you know, and Laura and everyone else. The friendship that I've developed with you all kind of in tandem with this 5-year saga since you filed this lawsuit has been really amusing for me, to say the least. But this was one of the news kind of lightning rods, if you will, that when you filed that, it got me more involved in the YIMBY movement, and now I'm doing a lot of stuff in SF YIMBY, but I'm really glad to see Inclusive Lafayette has taken off, and I just wanted to appreciate and send my appreciation. The other thing I wanted to point out was something I didn't really have time to fully expand upon in my comments when they last were hearing this project earlier last week. I grew up in Walnut Creek, right, which is right adjacent to Lafayette. I have relatives who live in Lafayette who hate your lawsuit and don't know that I'm friends with you. You know, the funny thing for me is the thing that I keep going back and thinking to from my childhood about, it wasn't even about housing at the time, but as we all know, housing and schools are related, and people bring up school quality and like wanting to find a place where you can get a good school. Was the saga from my middle school and high school experience when they were basically like employing private investigators to chase down people who didn't live within the Acalanes Union High School district. And because, you know, they were getting very, very strict in 2004-05 around enforcing the borders and saying, you live in Concord, you can't send your school here, or you can't send your kid here, go back. There were a bunch of people who I was friends with in freshman year. They evaporated, as Subin put it, in my sophomore year of high school. And that was because people got really, really aggressive all of a sudden about this territorial boundaries with the school district. And as a kid, it baffled me. I didn't really understand it at the time. I didn't know why it was such a big deal. I was like, what's the big deal? My friend was here and now she's gone. And I don't know why she's going to school at this other school up the block, whatever. And you know, it's the kind of thing that I haven't fully fleshed out my thoughts on, but it's the kind of thing that I hope that we as a movement, as we continue to grow and get better and expand and dig deeper into the stuff that Jeremy was beginning to talk about around using this to unpack institutional racism, that we lean more deeply into the arguments around how this stuff is so intertwined with schools, because it's extraordinarily frustrating to me. And I've never really been able to expand on those comments, but I wanted to make a point of highlighting how they're very related. Thanks, Laura.
Thank you.
For sharing.
Yes. And as somebody who goes to Lafayette for Passover sometimes and does not discuss the lawsuit, I can empathize quite a bit. I am going to, anybody else want to pile on before I go to the next person? All right, I'm going to go to Curtis. You're on, Curtis.
Hello, can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Hey, just wanted to give some quick thanks. Stephen, I just want to thank you so much for standing up for what you believe in, and I'm so heartened to hear that it didn't cost you what you thought it was going to cost you, that you were able to keep fighting the good fights in some really amazing towns. You're maybe hero is too strong of a word, but like I'm so heartened to hear that you were able to stand up for what you believe in. That was really, really cool, and thank you for doing so. And then to Jeremy, I just wanted to say thank you for starting Inclusive Lafayette, and it's so cool to see young people organize. I know you don't consider yourself a kid, but it's still cool to see young people organize, and especially around complex issues like this. And as a YIMBY Action member, I really hope that our two organizations can, in the future work together, since it seems like our goals are very aligned.
Can I just pitch in and say thank you, Curtis? That was really, really nice to hear the kind words. And I'll just say kind of autobiographically, I went to a really liberal college and was very an activist in college and a graduate school, worked on anti-apartheid stuff in the 1980s, and then chose public service as a career, because I thought this was a way I could use my life and career to make a difference. And honestly, I felt like going to a place like Lafayette is a place, maybe that's the best place for me to be of all, because there's a lot of people in well, just whatever. So, but at some point, it's easy to get inured to your position and to get comfortable where you are, and maybe not see the big picture anymore. And I felt like I didn't want that to be me, and so it's really I'm really grateful that you would say that. But I'm also really impressed that there's young people like Jeremy. And not quite as young people like Laura and Sonja involved in this work now, because you're the future, and you're going to make a difference with your careers.
Well, that is a great note to let Benji have the last word. So I'm going to bring in Benji. What do you have to say to your brother and to all of us?
I don't know this person. Never met.
Well, I'm sort of working on the Instagram for our community, and I'm want to start a discussion about what facts and arguments do you think are most convincing to fire up this base of people on Instagram? I don't know that you've experienced. Stephen, I used your simplified story of Lafayette in the outline for the post, but what more should we put in?
So I'm not exactly sure I understand the question, but let me make a point that occurred to me, and it's just kind of a storytelling thing. I can recall early in my time in Lafayette, there was a land use application that came before the city council, and it was a guy who wanted to build a self-service car wash along Mount Diablo Boulevard, down at the corner of 2nd Street and Mount Diablo Boulevard. There's this little kind of vacant blue building across the street from McDonald's. You may know it. And so he comes in, and this was about, I think Art Ungar may have even been on the planning commission at the time. It was in the early 1990s. And he says, he has an option to buy the property. He files an application to build a self-service car wash. you know, where the wand, where you stand around, you know, it's got the cinder block walls and you stand around and you wash your car. And this became a point of controversy because some people didn't want a self-service car wash on Mount Diablo Boulevard. They wanted a more boutique-y kind of art gallery, you know, Carmel kind of feel for the downtown. And it winds up, the matter winds up getting appealed to the city council, and we're at the council meeting, and one city council member says, you know, I'm not inclined to approve this because it doesn't comport with my vision for what Lafayette should be or will become. And they continue the item, and then we go into a closed session. And I think I can say this now because it's like 20 years old without, you know, violating confidentiality agreements. But the lawyer in the closed session, he says to the council member, you know, you can't say that kind of thing at a city council meeting because honestly, this isn't about what your vision is. It honestly doesn't matter what your vision is for the city. What matters is whether this land use application comports with the general plan and the zoning ordinance and state law. And if it does, then you have to approve it. If it doesn't, you're going to lose that lawsuit. And, you know, I think that's a hard lesson for both city council members, planning commissioners, and members of the public to learn sometimes, and that's that this isn't about what your opinion is. It's about what the code says and what the law says.
Well, and your opinion is so likely to be based in bias. You know, what is your vision? You know, is something that it's very hard not for that to be based in bias and prejudice and who gets to be part of my community and who is not part of my, I mean, this is why we need rule of law, and this is why we need to say what's allowed and what isn't, is because it's impossible to not have bias come into that question of, well, does your idea comport with my vision of what this community should be?
So to Benji's question about convincing things that are convincing, I guess what we're saying, Benji,
two young people,
you should be telling people their opinion doesn't matter. Is
No,
that the takeaway?
Well, I think that's part of the point, is that your opinion doesn't matter. It's whether the application is consistent with the general plan and with California state law. That is what ultimately is going to decide this land use application.
This is a riddle I have all the time, right? Because it really is, how do you tell somebody you can't believe everything you feel, you know, and have that be something that they are like, oh yeah, great. You know, I hate this thing, but I should rise above it. But it's not impossible. And that's definitely appealing, obviously, to some people. What are you going to say, Jeremy?
I think you reach a very, you touched on this very difficult point, which is like, how do you convince people who do not want to think differently that they should think differently? And I think that you really, I mean, Lafayette is no different from any other community. You can segment off the population in a set of ways that has nothing to do with concrete values. It has to do with like conservatism and liberalism. And it's a question to some extent of like how much people are interested in like making sure things stay the same and how much they want to make things different. And oftentimes you have people who are like maybe kind of liberal at heart, but conservative in instinct, who this is like the middle ground, a big chunk of the middle ground that's that way. And you can't, I don't know if it, I mean, it's not you can't, I don't know if it changes hearts and minds to tell people your opinion doesn't matter as much as to ask them like over and over and over again, like, why do you think this way? And when they say a reason that doesn't quite add up, to point out why it doesn't quite add up as respectfully as possible, and ask again, like, so now that you know this new thing, why do you think this way? And in that process, this is what I've done like over and over and over again with individuals in Lafayette. Through that process, you largely find out who the people are who were never willing to change in the first place, who there's nothing you can do to convince them. They don't want to change, and they're not open-minded enough to do so. And the people who maybe have just, you know, kind of built in these biases sometimes, but it's a different like I'm talking about people in general. If you look at the city council, I think what you and Stephen were saying, and Laura, like what all of you were saying is like perfectly accurate. The council has a different decision than the average person to make, and it's about the state law and their own personal conviction about what is right as much as it is about what the constituents want. And that's the council. But then you come to actually like young people, which are different than the rest in some respects. And I, even though I'm 23, sometimes feel like I don't have as much insight into people my age as I would like. I don't have as much insight into anyone as I would like. They're all confusing and different. But with young people particularly, it appears right now maybe that more and more of them get really fired up about injustice and inequality in a way that maybe some people have in the past have thought more about themselves. But the barrier that we hit with young people, this strong barrier, is that sometimes the way that injustice and inequality manifest in this world are very complicated, and housing, maybe more so than most of the other ways, is really complicated, and it requires both like a historical perspective to fully grasp and some kind of understanding of the modern legal framework, which is really hard to grasp. And even for full-grown adults, they clearly don't understand it most of the time, because otherwise there wouldn't be so much mindless opposition to development in places where it makes sense and legally can't be disapproved. And so when it comes to young people, it's largely about making a connection, because they're already primed to like get into the injustice, but making a connection about where the injustice lies. Like, just one last thing. One of the biggest pushbacks that I've gotten from people who are young, who are like my version of progressive, is from people who are saying, I mean, they're anti-capitalist. They're like, what, we don't want development. Like, this is it's part of a bad system, and development happening this way, like, it should be the state. And that's, I mean, I think YIMBY talks about in its like kind of introduction rules, like it's not about political ideology, it's about housing and people and community, and really like people and community and the housing to support those things. But yet, I think a lot of young people struggle with some ideological conviction clashing up against like realistic necessities to address the problems that currently exist. And maybe trying to align the ideology with conviction, and like on the young people side, like encourage open-mindedness in every way possible is as impactful as anything else can be. But a lot of it has to do with like, you know, if it's messaging, you got to talk about social justice and injustice in the world. Like that's the messaging to hammer home for people who are younger.
Yeah.
Thank you for letting me go on for so long. Wow.
No, this is good. I mean, I do think I'll end it a little bit here, but we have this huge benefit right now that people can conceive of this idea of structural racism. And we're in this place where people can understand, okay, how does the historical, laws that were passed with the intent to exclude people, and how do our existing laws continue to manifest that in practice? And I think, Stephen, you talked a lot about it. You know, it's something that comes up a lot. And the complexity of housing, we have this amazing gift in this world now of the concept of structural racism. And it is something that I think young people especially are primed to hear and understand and be able to incorporate into saying, like, does this have a disproportionate impact? And to be able to hear and understand is that it doesn't matter what's in somebody's heart. We don't have to have that argument. What's in your heart? Maybe you are racist, maybe you're not. I don't know. This has a disproportionate impact. And so let's talk about that. If you think that we shouldn't, and this is also, I think, for talking about, and to Benji's point, talking about what gets people fired up, right? well, we talk about values and we talk about personal stories. There is no statistic. I mean, you know, if you're using a statistic to make emblematic how this embodies a value that we should have, you get one statistic, you get one infographic, but long white papers and a lot of facts aren't going to move people. Personal stories and talking about values that they already have. All of us have values that are in conflict with one another. You know, I have a value of like, I want my grandmother to get everything that she wants, right? She's a very particular person. I want everything that she might want to happen for her, but also that is sometimes in conflict with what is beneficial for an entire community and what is beneficial for making our cities less racist over time. And I think that the more we can talk about values that people already have and that they want to be able to embody, and here is the path to making that real, the more powerful the pro-housing movement will be. And so I want to thank everybody for coming and joining us. This will be up on YouTube soon. And thank you for everybody. Have a good one. Any last words?
I really, really appreciate you having me to join this discussion. It's my first time doing anything like this, and I could not be more excited to talk with. I mean, somebody was talking about Stephen Falk, like they said hero might be too strong of a word. Stephen, you're one of my heroes, but so are you, Sonja, and Laura, who I was less familiar with before this thing, but like, oh, it's so cool that you already have been laying down the framework for how we address one of the greatest like intersectional issues in California, like in the modern moment in California. And I'm lucky to have your shoulders to stand next to and also stand upon.
So I'll say one last thing, which is that follows up on my earlier point that the question isn't what your vision is. The question is whether the application comports with law or the general plan. So the city of Lafayette is just now embarking on revising its general plan. So if you are somebody who cares, and Jeremy and I have spoken about this, if you care about the future of Lafayette and you want to make it a more just and equitable place, there isn't a more exquisite time to get involved than right now. And you should contact Jeremy, who will point you to the General Plan Advisory Committee.
Inclusive Lafayette's next long-term focus for the next 4 years, and hopefully not longer, but probably longer, will be the general plan. Join us in imagining a more inclusive Lafayette.
And I will just say I enjoyed being on this panel with all of you immensely. And Sonja, it's better than sitting in mediation with you. So good to see you.
Nice to see you too.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.